The Reith Lectures is a series of annual BBC radio lectures given by leading figures of the day. They are commissioned by the BBC and broadcast on Radio 4 and the World Service. The lectures were inaugurated in 1948 to mark the historic contribution made to public service broadcasting by Lord Reith, the corporation's first Director General. Reith maintained that broadcasting should be a public service that aimed to enrich the intellectual and cultural life of the nation. It is in this spirit that the BBC each year invites a leading figure to deliver the lectures. The aim is to advance public understanding and debate about issues of contemporary interest. We will be reviewing all 4 lectures by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Gwen Adshead, starting today and then once a week for the next 3 weeks. But for now, let me hand you over to our deep dive team.
Welcome back to Crime Time, Inc. And today we're reviewing the first of 4 Reith lectures by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Gwen Adshead.
Oh, cool.
This one is titled, Is Violence Normal?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a pretty loaded question, right?
It is. And Dr. Adshead, she isn't shying away from the complexity at all.
No?
She's diving deep into, what makes people violent, why some seem more prone to it, and how others manage those same emotions without lashing out.
Right.
What's really fascinating here is she's not just an academic. She's worked inside prisons and high-security hospitals like Broadmoor for years.
Okay, so she's seen the reality of violence up close.
Exactly.
That's got to give her a different perspective than someone just theorizing about it.
Absolutely. And right away, she points out something we all know, but maybe don't think about much.
Yeah.
We're surrounded by violence.
Yeah.
Movies, TV shows, even the news, it's everywhere.
True.
Yeah.
And it's not just passive consumption either.
Right.
It's about how popular true crime is. Or even those historical dramas full of murder plots.
Oh, totally.
We're kind of obsessed with violence, aren't we?
We are. Dr. Adshead argues that points to a universal truth. All humans have the capacity for cruelty. It's kind of unsettling, isn't it?
It is. But does that mean we're all destined to become violent criminals?
Well, thankfully, no.
Okay.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Dr. Adshead, based on her experience studying violence in everyday communities, says that there's no such thing as a typical killer.
Right.
She doesn't believe those profiles really get to the heart of the matter.
So if it's not about finding a specific type of person,
Yeah.
then what is it about?
For her, it's about understanding the meaning behind the violence,
Okay.
especially the relationships involved.
Okay.
This challenges those simplistic notions of monsters we often see in media.
Right.
In fact, she points out that in developed countries like the UK, homicide is statistically more likely to occur within a close relationship. You're more likely to be killed by someone you know, someone you're intimate with, than a complete stranger.
Wow. That's a chilling thought.
Yeah.
It really flips the script on the whole stranger danger idea, doesn't it?
It does, and that's why understanding the relational context is so crucial for prevention.
Right.
We need to move beyond stereotypes and look at the complex dynamics that lead to violence.
So how do we start to unpack those dynamics?
Yeah.
Because it seems like there's so much at play.
Right.
Individual personalities, social factors, maybe even random chance.
Right.
It's complicated.
It is. Dr. Adshead uses this really clever analogy, a bicycle lock.
Okay.
Imagine each number on the lock represents a risk factor for violence.
Okay.
Individually, they might not be enough to unlock that violence, but when they come together in a specific combination, things can turn dangerous.
Okay. I like that.
Yeah.
So what are some of the numbers on this lock?
Right.
What kinds of factors contribute to this risk?
Well, she points out that many of them are social in nature. Poverty, lack of opportunity, rigid gender roles.
Yeah.
But then, that final click can be almost anything.
Right.
An insult, a perceived threat, a bad day at work,
Yeah.
something seemingly insignificant that unleashes this wave of emotion
Right.
and distorts their perception.
It's almost like that straw that breaks the camel's back.
Exactly.
And it can be so hard to predict what that straw will be.
Exactly. And that unpredictability is part of what makes violence so difficult to address.
Yeah, this brings us to another point Dr. Adshead makes.
Yeah.
The danger of normalizing violence.
Mm-hmm.
You know how sometimes people try to justify their bad actions by blaming others or downplaying the harm they caused?
Right.
She calls this neutralization.
Yes.
And it's a huge obstacle to preventing future violence.
That's right. Much of Dr. Adshead's work with perpetrators involves challenging this neutralization discourse.
Okay.
It's about helping them understand that they did have a choice.
Right.
That their actions weren't inevitable. That's essential for rehabilitation and reducing the risk of reoffending.
So it's not just about punishment.
Yeah.
It's about getting them to really confront what they did and take responsibility.
Precisely. And she argues that seeing perpetrators as individuals capable of change rather than just mindless monsters is crucial to this process.
It makes you wonder about those cases where someone does something horrific,
Right.
but they're found not fully responsible in court due to mental illness or other factors.
Yeah.
How do we balance accountability with understanding those situations?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
Dr. Adshead actually shares a story about a man named Jack who killed his mother while experiencing severe mental illness.
Okay.
Even though he wasn't fully responsible legally, he still expressed deep regret
Wow.
and acknowledged the impact of his actions.
That's powerful.
It is.
It shows that even when someone is struggling,
Yeah.
they can still grapple with the consequences of their choices.
Exactly. And it highlights how Dr. Adshead's approach goes beyond simplistic labels.
Right.
She's pushing us to understand the nuances of human behavior,
Yeah.
even when it's disturbing or uncomfortable.
It's a lot to think about.
It is. It really is a lot to consider. And that leads perfectly into Dr. Adshead's next lecture, where she tackles a big one.
Okay.
Is there such a thing as evil?
Ooh, okay. Now we're getting philosophical.
Right.
I mean, after hearing about all these real-life cases, it's tempting to think that evil must exist, right?
It's a natural reaction, but Dr. Adshead encourages us to resist those easy answers.
Okay.
She spent years working with perpetrators,
Right.
and her experience has shown her that human behavior is way more complex than we often give it credit for.
So she's not saying that people who do terrible things are inherently good, is she?
No, not at all. It's more that she's challenging the idea that they're inherently evil either.
Okay.
It's not about excusing their behavior, but about understanding the path that led them to that point.
That makes sense. It's like if we just label someone as evil and call it a day,
Right.
we're missing out on a whole lot of information that could help us prevent future violence.
Exactly. It's those individual stories, those motivations and experiences that can offer insights into potential interventions.
This reminds me of something else Dr. Adshead talked about,
Yeah.
the importance of responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
She mentioned that a lot of perpetrators try to shift blame or downplay the harm they've caused.
Right. She calls that neutralization discourse.
Yeah.
And it's a major hurdle to rehabilitation.
Right.
It's only when someone truly owns up to their actions without making excuses
Right.
that they can start to change.
So it's not enough to just punish someone.
Right.
We also need to create space for them to confront what they did and understand the impact it had on others.
Absolutely. And that's where this whole concept of evil can get tricky.
Okay.
If we believe someone is inherently evil, it's hard to imagine them ever changing, right?
I see what you mean. It's like
Yeah.
we've already written them off as a lost cause.
Exactly. Dr. Adshead is pushing back against that kind of thinking.
Okay.
She believes that even people who have done horrific things are capable of change.
Right.
It's not easy, but it's possible.
But how do we reconcile that with the need for accountability? I mean, victims and their families deserve justice.
Of course.
And part of that is seeing the perpetrator held responsible.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to the idea that imprisonment itself is the punishment.
Right.
The real work, the rehabilitation, needs to go beyond just locking someone up.
Okay.
It's about addressing those underlying factors, those numbers on the bicycle lock that contributed to the violence in the first place.
So it's about helping them understand why they did what they did,
Yes.
but also making sure they know that it was still their choice.
Right.
And they have to live with the consequences.
Exactly. It's a long and complicated process.
Right.
And there are no easy answers. But Dr. Adshead seems to believe that it's possible to hold people accountable while also recognizing their humanity and potential for growth.
It's definitely a challenging concept.
Yeah.
It makes me think about how we often portray perpetrators in media as these one-dimensional villains with no redeeming qualities.
Yeah.
It's easier to distance ourselves that way,
Right.
but it doesn't really get us any closer to understanding the complexities of violence.
That's such a good point. Dr. Adshead's work is a reminder that perpetrators are real people
Right.
with their own backstories, motivations, and even struggles.
Yeah.
And acknowledging that complexity doesn't mean condoning their actions.
Right. It's about seeing the bigger picture.
Yeah.
The web of factors that led to that moment of violence.
Uh-huh.
And maybe, just maybe, it's about finding ways to intervene before it happens again.
I think that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? To move beyond simply reacting to violence and start preventing it. And that requires a shift in thinking, a willingness to engage with these uncomfortable truths about human nature.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive so far?
Well, I think the biggest one is that violence isn't some isolated phenomenon caused by evil people.
Okay.
It's woven into the fabric of our society, our relationships, even our own individual psychology.
Right.
And understanding those connections is the first step toward addressing it.
It's almost like Dr. Adshead is challenging us to look in the mirror, isn't it?
Yeah.
To acknowledge that capacity for cruelty within ourselves.
Yeah.
And then ask, what can we do to make sure it doesn't manifest in destructive ways?
That's a powerful way to put it. And it leads us to another key point.
Yeah.
The importance of responsibility.
Okay.
Not just for perpetrators, but for all of us.
Right.
What are the social conditions that contribute to violence?
Yeah.
How do we perpetuate harmful stereotypes?
Yeah.
These are questions we all need to be asking.
You know, it's funny. We started this deep dive talking about our fascination with violence in entertainment. Yeah. Now I'm wondering, what responsibility do those creators have?
Right.
Are they contributing to this normalization of violence that Dr. Adshead warns against?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the pervasiveness of this issue.
Right.
It's not just about individual acts of violence,
Right.
but about the messages we internalize,
Right.
the narratives we accept as normal.
This has been heavy stuff.
Yeah,
I need a palate cleanser.
totally.
Let's talk about something lighter next time, like cute kittens.
Huh. I'm not sure Dr. Adshead's next lecture will involve kittens,
Probably not.
but I'm sure it will be just as thought-provoking as this one.
Okay, so we've talked about the capacity for cruelty, the bicycle lock of risk factors, and the danger of normalizing violence.
Right.
Where does Dr. Adshead go from there?
Well, this is where she brings it all together and asks, if violence isn't always about some inherent evil, then how do we make sense of those truly horrific acts we sometimes see?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
Because it's easy to just say, oh, that person must be a monster and call it a day.
Right.
But Dr. Adshead's pushing us to go deeper than that.
Exactly. And that's what I find so compelling about her work.
Yeah.
She's not afraid to ask the tough questions, even if there aren't easy answers.
So what does she say about those cases where someone commits an act of violence that seems, for lack of a better word, evil?
Well, she reminds us that even in those extreme cases, we need to consider the context.
Okay.
What were the circumstances that led up to that act?
Right.
What were the individual's motivations, their state of mind?
Okay.
It's not about excusing the behavior,
Right.
but about understanding the complex interplay of factors that contributed to it.
That reminds me of the bicycle lock analogy.
Yeah.
Maybe in those extreme cases, the numbers on the lock are just more numerous or more intense.
That's a great way to think about it. It could be a combination of severe trauma, mental illness, social isolation,
Right.
and then that final click that pushes them over the edge.
It's heavy stuff.
It is.
And it makes you wonder about the role of mental illness in all of this.
Yeah.
Because we often hear about cases where someone commits a violent act and it's attributed to their mental health.
Right. And Dr. Adshead acknowledges that mental illness can be a factor in some cases,
Okay.
but she's also careful to point out that it's not a simple cause and effect relationship.
Right.
Most people with mental illness are not violent.
Right.
And even when it is a factor, it's important to consider all the other numbers on that lock.
It's about looking at the whole person, not just reducing them to a diagnosis.
Exactly. And that leads to another really important point. Rehabilitation.
Okay.
Can people who have committed acts of violence truly change?
That's a question I think a lot of people struggle with,
Yeah.
especially when we see those headlines about horrific crimes. It can be hard to imagine those individuals ever being safe to reintegrate into society.
It's understandable to feel that way,
Yeah.
but Dr. Adshead seems to believe that change is possible.
Okay.
Even in those seemingly hopeless cases,
Yeah.
she talks about how much of her work involves helping perpetrators confront their actions,
Right.
take responsibility, and develop empathy for their victims.
So it's not just about locking them up and throwing away the key?
No, not at all.
Okay.
She sees imprisonment as a consequence,
Right?
a necessary step in holding someone accountable,
Okay.
but the real work, the work of rehabilitation,
Yeah.
needs to happen both inside and outside prison walls.
It makes you wonder, though, how effective those rehabilitation programs really are.
Yeah.
I mean, some people seem to come out of prison even more hardened and dangerous than when they went in.
That's a valid concern, and it speaks to the complexity of the issue.
Right.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach to rehabilitation, and unfortunately, some programs are more effective than others. But Dr. Adshead seems optimistic that with the right support and interventions,
Yeah.
even people who have committed terrible acts can turn their lives around.
It's a lot to take in.
Mhm.
And I think it challenges a lot of the assumptions we often make about violence and those who perpetrate it.
It definitely does. Dr. Adshead's work is a reminder that the conversation about violence is messy, uncomfortable, and full of gray areas.
Yeah.
But if we want to truly understand and address it, we need to be willing to lean into that complexity.
Well said. So what's the big takeaway for our listeners today?
Yeah.
What's the one thing you hope they'll walk away with after this deep dive?
I think the most important message is this. Violence is not a simple problem with simple solutions.
Right.
It's a complex issue that requires us to move beyond easy answers and embrace nuance, compassion, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
I love that. It's a call to action, isn't it?
It is.
To not just be passive consumers of information,
Right.
but to actively engage with these difficult questions and be part of the solution.
It seems like we've just started this exploration of the world of violence. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with you as we review the remaining lectures.
Absolutely. Dr. Ads has given us a lot to think about, and I have no doubt the rest of her lectures will be just as thought-provoking. So until next time, keep those minds engaged, and we'll be back soon for another look at Dr. Gwen Ads' exploration of violence.